We have talked a lot on this program about the backlog when it comes to processing rape kits and how that impacts victims. Well, one woman's ordeal is detailed in a book called Jane Doe, January, My 20-Year Search for Truth and Justice. Now, I just spoke with its author, Emily Winslow. You know, unfortunately, there's no other place to start than the beginning and share with our audience what happened on that horrible morning, or evening, I should say, of January 12th of 1992 in Pittsburgh.
I was a student at Carnegie Mellon. It was Christmas break. I went out to run an errand, and a man followed me into my apartment building and then forced his way into my apartment, and then he raped me.
We have spoken to other victims who've shared with our audience the process of a rape kit and the backlogs, and we'll get into some of the mechanics in a second. But for those victims courageous enough to consent and to do a rape kit, it is a very traumatic experience, isn't it? It
was not fun, but I felt glad that the crime was being taken seriously. So while the experience physically was not one that I would enjoy, I was really glad that the police, that the doctors, that everybody who was dealing with me was dealing with this as a very serious crime and as something that they wanted justice for.
And the book chronicles that. For 20 years, you became your own best advocate. And while certainly the police aren't portrayed as indifferent, at different times throughout the book, whether they're overwhelmed, whether it's because of turnover, explain from your vantage point the frustrations, the challenges, and also the process of trying to get people to basically, instead of you being known as Jane Doe January, that they kept trying to move along in a search for justice for your case here. How would you describe law enforcement throughout that time?
The law enforcement that I dealt with in Pittsburgh were always very respectful and very kind to me. But back in 1992, there was not a lot that they could do in a rape case for which there was no known suspect. The man was a stranger, and even though we had evidence that could be analyzed for DNA, at that time there was no national database of criminal DNA, no state database of criminal DNA. So at that time, doing an analysis, there would have been nothing to do with the result. There would have been no one to compare it to. So for the first 10 years of the 20 years that I eventually waited to get my kit tested, the first 10 years, it kind of made sense. And then in the second 10 years, it was just a matter of the current caseload was overwhelming. There wasn't really room to go back over the old cases.
But you've learned throughout this process that there's a lot of bureaucracy. A lot of different agencies have to both be on the same page. There's math that's a component to this, not just of the current caseloads, but also the costs associated with processing these rape kits. And it kind of depends on zip code and a lot of other things that we're into, let alone the tax base. What are some of the things that would surprise our audience as to which rape kits get processed and when, and also how?
Well, now I'm really glad to say that things are going to move along much more quickly because of the backlog grants that came about in autumn of last year from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and from the federal government, tens of millions of dollars trying to clear the backlog. Before those massive grants were made available, there were smaller grants, but it was much, much harder for even a jurisdiction that wanted to clear their backlog just to find the resources to do it.
I want to read a quote for our audience for what Loretta Lynch, and now Attorney General, but prior to that, obviously involved in the New York office, she said, talking about that block grant of funding that was made available in 2015, she said, "For anyone who's felt isolated and afraid, left out and left behind as a result of a sexual crime, our message is clear. We will not forget you. We will not abandon you. You are not alone." Emily, did you feel all those things before the money was made available, and even with the grants that have been made available, do you believe those words?
I had felt very frustrated that I had to keep phoning up, that I had to keep reminding the police about the case and telling them that it was still important to me. That was indeed very frustrating. When finally my kit was tested and my case was prosecuted and there was an arrest, that feeling of vindication and of being truly respected, not just by individuals, but by the whole justice machine, was massive.
So then we get to the point in the story where you get the phone call rather than making the phone call to Pittsburgh law enforcement. They say, Emily, we've got a hit. They got a DNA match. In fact, we mentioned before Jane Doe January. There was a Jane Doe November, also in the same Pittsburgh neighborhood where you were assaulted. That same year, another woman was also assaulted. And through that connection, they found a man by the name of Irving Fryer. Talk about what it was like, Arthur Fryer, excuse me, when you got that phone call, and then take us through what happened with the case and obviously an unfulfilling conclusion.
What had happened was this hit came through not from my kit, but from the kit of that related case. And so I was contacted so that I would get a heads up before it appeared in the news that this man was being arrested. And at the time, my kit had not yet been tested, but the police felt very confident from similarities in the case that he was very likely to be my assailant as well, and indeed he turned out to be. Unfortunately, the prosecution that we then worked toward, the trial that we then worked toward over the next 9 months, eventually just 3 days before I was to travel, the prosecution had to be withdrawn because of a clash of the state law on which our prosecution was depending, which had to do with the statute of limitations, and with a decision that the Supreme Court had made regarding a similar law in another state. So the prosecution ended up being withdrawn.
I can only characterize it as an important book, and for anyone who's even followed the issue of rape kits and the backlogs of them, to get the human connection to what surrounds it rather than just the case number, I think you go a long, long way to doing that. Again, the book Jane Doe January, My 20-Year Search for Truth and Justice. Emily Winslow, I really appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
When we come back, we'll take a look at some local headlines.